In the modern financial era, we casually throw around the term mega-corporation. We look at companies like Apple, Amazon, or Saudi Aramco, and we marvel at their trillion-dollar market caps and global logistics networks. We assume that corporate supremacy is a modern invention, born from the digital age and the internet. But the truth is far darker, and the blueprint was drawn over 400 years ago. To find the true apex predator of corporate history, we must travel back to the cold, fog-drenched docks of London in the year 1600. At that time, the global economy was dictated by a single, incredibly dangerous commodity: spices. Nutmeg, cloves, and pepper were worth their weight in pure gold. But to get them, merchants had to sail around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope to the East Indies. It was a financial suicide mission. You could spend a fortune outfitting a massive wooden galleon, only to have it sink in a typhoon or get captured by pirates. The financial risk of a single voyage was capable of bankrupting an entire family bloodline. To solve this problem of catastrophic risk, a group of 218 London merchants gathered in a dimly lit hall and invented a financial weapon that would forever alter the trajectory of human history. They invented the joint stock megacorporation. Instead of one man funding one ship and carrying all the risk, they divided the ownership of the expedition into tiny, equal shares. Anyone could buy a share. If a ship sank, no single investor was ruined. They only lost their small fraction. But if a ship returned packed with spices, the massive profits were distributed equally among the shareholders in the form of a dividend. They had successfully socialized the risk while privatizing the infinite upside. They petitioned Queen Elizabeth I, and she granted them a royal charter, giving them an absolute, legally enforced monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. They called themselves the Honorable East India Company. Welcome to Case 020. Today, we open the massive, blood-stained file on the world's first megacorporation. We will investigate the brutal mechanics of the ultimate monopoly, the terrifying reality of a corporation with its own private military, and the very first instance of a company deemed too big to fail. For the first 150 years of its existence, the East India Company operated primarily as a highly aggressive merchant syndicate. They built fortified trading posts along the coast of India, engaged in fierce commercial warfare with the Dutch and the Portuguese, and generated massive, reliable dividends for their shareholders back in London. But as the company grew, its appetite shifted. The executives in London realized that trading for textiles and spices was a slow, labor-intensive way to generate revenue. They realized that the ultimate financial moat is not a superior product. The ultimate financial moat is sovereign power. In 1757, the East India Company executed the most violent hostile corporate takeover in human history. The company had slowly been building its own private corporate military to protect its warehouses. These were not mere security guards. The East India Company commanded an army of over 260,000 highly trained soldiers, a force roughly twice the size of the official British Army at the time. Under the command of a ruthless, ambitious executive named Robert Clive, the company's private army marched against the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. Through a combination of superior artillery and massive corporate bribery, Clive completely decimated the local forces. With that single victory, the East India Company stopped being a merchant trading firm. They effectively conquered Bengal, a region richer and more populous than all of Britain. The corporation forced the local emperor to sign a treaty granting the East India Company the Diwani, the absolute legal right to collect taxes on 10 million citizens. The company had achieved the ultimate corporate dream. They no longer had to manufacture goods or compete in the open market. They simply extracted revenue at the point of a bayonet. The citizens of Bengal were violently taxed, and those taxes were sent directly back to London to be paid out as corporate dividends to the company's shareholders. The East India Company had transformed a sovereign nation into a balance sheet. When a corporation is legally mandated to maximize shareholder value at all costs, and that corporation is handed absolute military control over a foreign population, the result is a mathematical and humanitarian catastrophe. The executives of the East India Company were not incentivized to build infrastructure, protect the citizens, or ensure the stability of Bengal. Their entire compensation structure and their survival in the boardroom relied solely on keeping the stock price high and the dividend payments flowing. In 1770, a massive drought struck the Bengal region. Crops failed. The local population, already bled dry by the company's aggressive, punitive taxation, had absolutely no financial reserves to survive a bad harvest. A responsible sovereign government would have immediately suspended taxes, opened emergency grain reserves, and initiated relief efforts. But the East India Company was not a government. It was a publicly traded corporation, and corporations do not suspend their revenue models for charity. Instead of offering relief, the company's executives actually increased the tax rate by 10% to ensure their profit margins remained stable during the crisis. Furthermore, the company's military actively hoarded whatever rice was left in the region to feed their own corporate soldiers and to sell on the black market at hyper-inflated prices. The result was the Great Bengal Famine. The meticulous corporate accountants of the East India Company logged the revenue, but they completely ignored the bodies in the streets. It is estimated that up to 10 million people, nearly one-third of the population of Bengal, starved to death. It was a tragedy manufactured by a spreadsheet. The famine was not a failure of logistics. It was a success of corporate revenue extraction. Millions died solely to ensure that the dividend checks cleared in London. And, in the twisted, sociopathic logic of the financial markets, the strategy worked. Despite the total collapse of the local population, the East India Company recorded a massive increase in net profit for the year 1771. But the arrogant, violent expansion of the East India Company contained the seeds of its own destruction. The corporation had grown too massive, too leveraged, and too corrupt. The executives operating in India, known as nabobs, were looting the company treasury to build their own personal fortunes. They returned to England with unfathomable wealth, buying massive political influence and bribing members of parliament to look the other way. Meanwhile, the sheer cost of maintaining a private army of 260,000 men to subjugate the entire Indian subcontinent was creating a catastrophic drain on the company's capital reserves. By 1772, the financial reality caught up with the corporate illusion. A severe credit crisis swept through Europe. The East India Company suddenly found itself holding massive, unsold inventories of tea in its London warehouses, and it had completely run out of cash. The mega corporation was unable to pay its tax bill to the British government, and it was entirely unable to pay its sacred shareholder dividend. The East India Company was facing absolute, total bankruptcy. But the corporation had entrenched itself too deeply into the fabric of the British Empire. Many members of Parliament were themselves shareholders. The company accounted for nearly half of Britain's total trade. If the East India Company collapsed, it would drag the entire British banking system down with it. They had achieved the ultimate hostage situation. They were the world's very first entity to be deemed too big to fail. The corporation crawled to the British government and demanded a massive bailout, and the government complied. Parliament passed the Regulating Act of 1773, loaning the company over £1 million of taxpayer money to save it from ruin. But to help the company pay off its debts, the government also passed the Tea Act. This law allowed the East India Company to dump its massive surplus of tea into the American colonies without paying the standard export taxes, undercutting the local American merchants. The British government prioritized the survival of the corporation over the economic freedom of its own citizens. When the company ships arrived in Boston Harbor carrying the bailout tea, the enraged American colonists boarded the vessels and threw the cargo into the water. The East India Company's desperate need for a corporate bailout became the direct financial trigger for the American Revolution. The bailout saved the company, but it cost them their independence. Over the next 80 years, the British government slowly, methodically tightened the leash around the corporation's neck. Parliament passed a series of charter acts that gradually stripped the East India Company of its absolute trade monopolies. The company was forced to transition from an independent commercial juggernaut into a heavily regulated administrative arm of the British state. But they still maintained their massive private army, and they still treated India as a corporate asset to be squeezed. The breaking point finally arrived in 1857. The company's corporate soldiers, known as sepoys, had been pushed to their absolute breaking point by decades of cultural insensitivity, brutal discipline, and ruthless corporate management. They mutinied. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was a massive, bloody uprising that nearly shattered the company's grip on the subcontinent. The private corporate military lost control, and the British government was forced to deploy its own official, national army to brutally crush the rebellion and restore order. For the British Crown, the illusion was finally broken. They could no longer allow a private, profit-driven corporation to rule a continent of hundreds of millions of people. The following year, Parliament passed the Government of India Act. The world's first megacorporation was stripped of all its power. Its massive private army was seized and absorbed into the British military. Its vast territories, its infrastructure, and its administrative control were nationalized by the Crown. The Honorable East India Company was reduced to a shell, existing only on paper to manage its final dividend payments before it was officially, permanently dissolved in 1874. The history of the East India Company is not just a history lesson. It is the ultimate, terrifying parable about the endgame of corporate supremacy. When you build an automated trading system or analyze a modern mega-cap stock, you are interacting with the financial architecture that was designed by the merchants of 1600. The joint stock corporation is a brilliant machine for dividing risk and generating wealth. But the East India Company serves as a stark warning about the fatal danger of the ultimate monopoly. When a corporation removes all competition, when its moat becomes so wide that it transforms into a sovereign border, the market ceases to function. When the pursuit of the quarterly dividend is detached from all human consequence, the system inevitably cannibalizes itself. The modern strategist must recognize that true absolute monopolies are inherently unstable. They require increasing amounts of leverage, control, and eventually violence to maintain their profit margins. And as the East India Company proved, when an entity grows so large that it holds the entire system hostage, it will eventually face the ultimate margin call. And that margin call is usually executed by the state. This closes Case File 020.